I'm often asked, what books do I read? Well, this list isn't exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a damn good start. Here's the books I recommend and the order I recommend reading them in. Remember, this list is meant so that each book read builds on the last. Anyone who's trying to find out real African history has to start with George G.M. James' Stolen Legacy. This book lays out a brief overview of African history centering mainly on Egypt, one of the first books of note to challenge the white revision of African history and boldly declare that the Egyptians were indeed black. It details the cultural contributions of the ancient Africans in Kemet to their backward pupils in Greece via the priests of the Egyptian mystery system. It's a great work for the beginner as well as the already well-informed, since it lays out complex points in layman's terms. A short read, about 120 pages, but still dense with information. Next comes one of the greatest books I've ever read, Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop's The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality. This seminal work blew the lid off the Egyptian debate by using what in the 1950s were the latest technologies to subject the bodies of the ancient Egyptians to true rigorous scientific scrutiny. Dr. Diop developed the melanin dosage test, which he used to successfully prove the Egyptian cells were packed with melanin like any other black person, and not like some Afro-Hamite or some Afro-Semite or European. He also established the blood type of the Egyptians was the same as the Africans rather than Arabs or Europeans. He also tracked the Egyptian language out of the Nile Valley all the way to the Wolofs of Senegal. And in doing so, he laid out the only true connection between Egypt and the rest of the world. The fact that Dr. Diop tracked the language of the Egyptians is especially important since anthropologists use language as one of the main means of tracking historical ethnic migrations. Dr. Diop's seminal work is a must-have for any student of Africa. Now that we've explored the rudiments of African history, we have to move on to what happened. How did it all come to an end? That brings us to Dr. Chancellor Williams' The Destruction of African Civilization. In his magnum opus, Dr. Williams laid out the greatness of African civilization from Ethiopia to the Nile Delta. Then he tracked the migrations of foreigners into Africa, starting with the Asiatics into the Nile Valley, and following this through the Mediterranean invaders, later the Arabs, and finally the Europeans. Dr. Williams tracks the rise and fall of Aksum, Egypt, Songhai, Mali, Central Africa, Munamatapa in Zimbabwe, and Liberia as a puppet colony of the U.S. He also lays out how the Africans had battled these invaders, mostly winning the wars, a little-known truth of history. The problem was the Africans often lost the peace, such as the case with the brilliant Nubian victory at the city of Dongola. The Arabs were beaten so badly that they didn't try to invade Africa ever again. Not with a standing army anyway. They instead began a gradual immigration into Africa that eventually gave them a toehold throughout the northern nations. Wonder if that kind of thing could happen to Africa again today. Now, in what I consider to be a fitting companion piece to Dr. Williams' work, I also recommend Dr. Martin Bernal's Black Athena. The first 120 to 150 pages, that is, because that magisterial bit of research picks up where Dr. Williams left off. While Dr. Williams shows how and why Africans were displaced physically and politically, Dr. Bernal explains how we were purged historically, and what specific individuals were doing the purging. You can't understand how the myth of white Egypt got started until you understand how the truth of black Egypt got erased. Next we have Ivan van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus. Dr. van Sertima tracks how both Eastern and Western Africans came to America long before Columbus, using little-known sources like Christopher Columbus' diary as well as the accounts of the Africans themselves. Now, no account of African history would be complete without the stellar work of Dr. Benyekinen, Black Man of the Nile and his family. There's a ton of other works, and that's one of the great things about the upsurge in African literature by African people, a body of works that tells our story the way it really happened. Is there more to do? Of course there is. The history of the Nile Valley is barely known, and Western Africa's history has barely even been touched upon. But for those who keep wondering what I read, here's just a few. And like all classics, you'll keep coming back to them. They become more relevant as your knowledge expands. And unlike Euroclown's books, These don't need to be revised or put aside when they're predictably disproven. That's the great thing about black truth.